Good morning. Thank you all for joining us today for our webinar on building a compelling federal budget. I'm Amy Miller, the Federal Grant Administrator at the Governor's Office of Planning and Research, or OPR. OPR is the state's comprehensive planning agency, and one of our many responsibilities is to provide resources and assistance on all aspects of federal grants. We serve as the state's single point of contact for the intergovernmental review of federal programs under the Executive Order, or EO 12372, and we hold free trainings like this one to encourage and improve the ability of people and organizations in California to pursue and manage federal grants. Next slide. You can find many more resources like this at the OPR website under the link for federal grants. You can see the link there, and we'll enter it in the chat later. So here you'll find the link for the online portal to comply with the EO 12372 process, along with many other federal grant resources, including the OPR Federal Grant Update e-list, which is a weekly email newsletter that highlights the latest federal grant opportunities, news, and events. This website is also where we'll be posting the links to the slides and recording from today's webinar. If you have any questions throughout the presentation, please enter them in the Questions tab, and we will answer them at the end. We'll also be using the Chat tab to share links throughout today's talk. Next slide. And before I turn things over to our presenter, I'd like to share a short disclaimer that the following information does not constitute legal advice and does not necessarily represent the views or endorsement of OPR, but is provided as a service to the grants community. And with that, I'd like to hand it off to our presenter, Julie Asel from Asel Grant Services.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to Building a Compelling Federal Budget. As Amy said, my name is Julie Asel, and I'm the President and CEO of Asel Grant Services. We're federal grant experts. We write proposals, help clients implement projects, and write reports for somewhere between 75 and 100 federal grants per year for institutions of higher education, nonprofits, school districts, healthcare systems, and behavioral health centers. Today's webinar will focus on grant forms and budget justifications. Many times, people leave forms to the last minute, and then they get surprised when they get into Workspace and realize that these forms are more complicated and a little quirky than kind of the standard foundation forms that they're used to. So the goal of today's training is to give you an opportunity to see these forms before you get into some of these online systems and provide some tips and tricks for various federal agency forms to make it easier for you. In addition, we'll talk about how to create federal budget justifications, which not only comply with the requirements of federal agencies, but will guide your post-award implementation success. Whether program or finance staff come to you for guidance on what the federal agency will approve, or whether you are responsible for creating the project budget of your federal grants, today's sessions will guide you on what is reasonable, allowable, and allocable, which are key components of any federal budget justification. Now, this webinar is designed to help you grow in your knowledge of federal budgets and budget justifications, so you're as comfortable as possible when the time comes for you to create a budget justification that will not only be approved by the federal grant agency, but will be easy to implement by your agency after the grant has been awarded. So we're going to start today by talking about the most common federal budget categories. Then we're going to talk about the budget forms for the federal departments that people apply to most frequently. Then we will discuss the federal definitions of reasonable, allowable, and allocable, how to justify all of the federal categories using these definitions, and how to ensure that your post-award documentation continues to document these three areas so expenditures are not rejected by local and federal auditors. Now, each of our webinar components today are aligned to the competencies and skills of the Grant Professional Certification Institute, who administers the Grant Professional Certified, or GPC for short. The GPC is the only nationally accredited credential for grant professionals. This credential is accredited by the National Commission for Certifying Agencies. All of our trainings have been approved for education points also by the Grant Professional Certification Institute through their Accepted Education program. Participants in today's session can earn 1 education point for this 60-minute training. These education points are applicable toward acquiring your GPC credential or maintaining your GPC certification. To learn more, I encourage you to go to their website, and this slide highlights the specific competencies and related skills to which the learning objectives of this training align. Today's training has also been approved by CFRE International for similar education points. So just to get acquainted with terminology today, we're going to talk about the most common federal budget categories. And to do that, we're going to start by taking a look at an actual budget form. We're going to start out with the Department of Education's budget form, and the most common form is their non-construction program. Now, if you're the type of person who likes to call things by the numbers, this form is the ED 524. Also known as the Budget Information for Non-Construction Programs. This form should not be confused with the SF 424, which is the standard application cover page. Now, these forms don't fit well into PowerPoint, so I'm kind of be switching to the forms themselves. Along the left, you see the budget categories. They include personnel, fringe benefits, travel equipment, supplies, contractual, construction, which is interesting, right, for a non-construction program, other, and then a line that adds them all up together for total direct costs. If you have an individual cost rate agreement, or if you're doing de minimis, you can apply that to line 9 with your indirect cost. Then notice training stipends, line 11, and then total costs. Now, right off the bat, let's start with personnel. Personnel is going to be anyone you're going to pay who works for the applicant organization. And what I really mean by anybody is that finance would classify them as a W-2 employee, meaning they would receive a W-2 at the end of the year, as opposed to a contractual employee who might be a 1099. So then you've got fringe benefits. These are going to be your payroll taxes, as well as health insurance, unemployment, retirement, things like that. Travel could include mileage in your community or travel to conferences, which you're disseminating project results. It might also include travel that you do for training. Something you're going to hear us talk a lot about is kind of how these different departments categorize travel related to training and how you should include those travel expenses in the forms. Number 4 is equipment. Please make sure that you understand federal guidelines related to equipment. Kind of a very generic answer I give people is that equipment is any object over $5,000. Now, if a single object costs $6,000, it most likely goes into equipment. Computers used to go in here, but nowadays computers are so inexpensive, they actually go into supplies, unless for some reason your particular organization is capitalizing those, which means it still goes into equipment. In addition, these are guidelines for the federal government. You might have lower levels for equipment in other areas. So just be aware that what you have to categorize things are and how the federal government categorizes them may be different. The next category is supplies. This is all kinds of supplies, everything from books, paper, office supplies, those types of things. Then you have contractual. Contractual expenses are anything you pay someone to do. This is where most of your 1099 related expenses will go. For example, you might have a consultant or a trainer coming into your organization and training your staff. It might be an individual contractor, so the expense line would just be, maybe the individual's name, or it might be a company. So you have 2 different kinds of business entities, but they're all both under contracts. Other is just that, anything else you can think of. Most notably, some programs have you put registration fees for conferences you're attending here, while all the other travel costs like hotel, food, airfare, etc., that all goes into the travel category. Now, we kind of skipped over construction. Really, you would never use this form for an actual construction project. And by that, I mean like building a building. But if for some reason you have some minor renovation items and there's a lot of rules around doing that, they might fall under the construction line here. Now, since we're here, we're going to talk also about specifically the Department of Education's budget form. First of all, most of these forms that you encounter are going to actually be online in Workspace. or one of the other federal agency portals, and this form is no exception. One of the things I like to be able to do, though, is to have access to these forms before I get into Workspace or Just Grants or Fastlane. That way, when I get into the online form, I'm just copying and pasting. I know quite a few people will also create these forms in Excel so that they total properly in advance. While this particular form does not, many budget forms can be easily converted into an Excel format. What you see here is they have given you project year 1 through project year 7. Very few grants these days actually go for 7 years, but it does sometimes happen, and they've been using this form for a very long time. Now, this particular form technically expires at the end of 2023 unless they decide they don't want to make any updates to it. They have made very few changes to this form over the years, and we really don't expect any major changes in the coming year. Now, most of the boxes in Section A are fairly straightforward to us as grant professionals. The numbers that go into these cells are just totals. Your budget narrative will actually show the detailed calculations and justifications. When you're online, line 9 automatically calculates your indirect cost. You can see that far left-hand column underneath the 10 where it says indirect cost. Once you're in the online system, it may automatically calculate the amount requested, but most of the time you need to manually add the indirect cost sum in those cells. Now, a note about indirect cost. At the bottom of this sheet, you'll see the note says this information is to be completed by your business office. I don't know about you, but a lot of times my business or finance office asks me those questions as the grant professional. So let's talk a little bit about these questions so that you can answer them for finance. 1, do you have an indirect cost rate agreement approved by the federal government? This is a formal indirect cost rate agreement. If you do not have it, the answer is no. If you do, the answer is yes. For example, a lot of universities and school districts applying for education grants have them. School districts, beware. If you're unaware whether you have one, you actually probably do. It's probably been assigned to you through your state education agency. Number 2 says, if you do have one, you have to be able to provide a copy. Typically, that copy might go in the attachments form as like with Department of Education grants, or it may go into your budget narrative section. The cost rate should have an associated effective period. Now, this is kind of funny because I don't know about you, but they don't always update our indirect cost rate agreements in a timely fashion. For example, I'll see a cost rate like this that's say good until June 30th of 2022. Here it is in October, and they haven't updated it yet. So you'll put the dates in here using numerals like 07-01, okay? Because that's what your agreement says, which you're attaching. Now, the approving federal agency is commonly the Department of Education, if you're a school district, not your state Department of Elementary and Secondary Education. If you're a university, it may be through another federal agency, and that's okay too. Occasionally, organizations we work with have applied through the Department of Education, or they may be also doing things with the Department of Health or Human Services. In that case, we just mark the X, tell them what agency it's through, and then at the end, you want to say what your indirect cost rate is, and just fill out that percentage. Now, not everybody has an indirect cost rate agreement. If this is your first federal grant and you're not a state, local government, or Indian tribe, and you aren't applying for funding under a training program or a restricted program, you may not have an approved indirect cost rate agreement. You might use what's called the de minimis rate. That's about 10% of MTDC. That's modified total direct cost. Now, there are 2 aspects to this. First, you need to make sure that you're going to use this, that you're not double dipping your administrative costs. We're not talking about that at length today because we're just covering these forms a little bit with your justification, but for most organizations, This is a great way for them to be able to recover some of those indirect costs that normally would be more difficult to assign to their programs. So many people want to say, yes, we do want to use the de minimis rate. You just want to take a look at 2 CFR 200.414 before you make that decision to make sure that you're able to comply with the listed requirements. The other thing to know is what modified total direct cost actually means. Modified total direct cost means you may not necessarily be able to apply that indirect cost rate percentage to all of the expenses in 1 through 8. For example, MTDC can be all of your direct salaries and wages, all of your applicable fringe benefits, all of your materials and supplies, all of your services, all of your travel, and up to the first 25,000 of each sub award. That's contract, regardless of the performance period of the sub award. But you need to be careful that if you have a contract or you're working with a partner with, say, a $30,000 contract, because you can only apply your indirect cost rate to that first $25,000 of that. In addition, modified total direct cost excludes equipment, capital expenditures, and training stipends. I used to work for a school district, and whenever we paid teachers to receive professional development, those were considered training stipends, and we could not apply our indirect cost to that. Now, if you're thinking about MTDC comprehensively, and not just to the Department of Education, other excluded areas are things like patient care, rental costs, tuition reimbursement, scholarship and fellowships, and other participants' support costs. They kind of consider it to be very similar. So that's why they don't allow you to put any indirect cost on top of training stipends. Now, there are some people, though, who choose not to do indirect costs at all for a variety of reasons, and that's fine. It's not a requirement. These forms will have your total direct costs. You'll add your indirect costs, and now you'll have the option that if you do not have an approved indirect cost rate agreement, you can use a temporary rate of 10% to be applied to just budgeted salaries and wages. That's not to be confused with the de minimis rate of 10%. So if you're agreeing to that, you can then propose to submit an indirect cost rate, perhaps during the time of your grant. But you only get 90 days after the date your grant is awarded, according to 34 CFR 75560. If your organization believes your indirect costs are going to be substantially higher than 10%, and there's a variety of reasons for that, on this very first grant, you can only get 10% of salaries and wages, with the idea that in future grants, once your indirect cost rate agreement has been negotiated, you'll be able to get a higher indirect cost rate agreement. But they will not change your awarded amount once you get a new indirect cost rate agreement. Now, there are several Department of Education programs in which you might have what's called a restricted rate. When I talked about the indirect cost rate agreement that my school district had, we had an unrestricted rate, which we almost never got to use because we were applying to the Department of Ed, and we had a restricted rate. If you're a school district or a university, chances are you have at least those two categories. I also see a lot of universities who have both an on-campus and maybe an off-campus indirect rate. You want to pay close attention whether the grant program that you're applying for is going to make you use a restricted indirect cost rate, or like the grant we just wrote for this university, because we're going to be working off campus, we chose to use our restricted rate. Frankly, grant professionals, most organizations that you work with will do their best to tell you that they want every single dime of indirect and to never use the restricted rate unless it's absolutely required. But almost every single Department of Education program that's discretionary is going to use either the restricted rate or the next one we'll talk about, which is the training rate program. On the other hand, there's a dichotomy between the universities or your institutions who want you to use the indirect rate and your program staff who do not want you to use the rate because they want as much money for their programs as possible. Now, you want to pay careful attention that if there is a training rate program, they actually limit you even further to just 8% of modified total direct costs. Frankly, in some school districts, some years have We've had a restricted rate that was below 8% anyway. We couldn't even max out at 8%. We were closer to like 4 or 5%. I see this question, can you now use the de minimis rate indefinitely? Yes, you can use the de minimis rate indefinitely. If your grant requires a cash match, then you may also have this very similar parallel for your non-federal matching funds, right? In essence, the second half of this form, it basically looks the same, except you don't have that additional indirect portion at the bottom. And direct is still absolutely true and valid in this, right? They don't have the directions in essence at the bottom. One of the things I have also shown here is the instructions at the bottom, which a lot of people find to be very helpful. This form and these directions will be a handout that will be sent to you as well, okay? Now, the next form we're going to talk about is the one for the Department of Health and Human Services. Again, this is a non-construction form. This one is titled SF424A, and this is probably one of the most common forms and frankly, one of the most confusing forms to many organizations we work with because people are encountering this grant form honestly, having never applied to a federal grant before. But the Department of Health and Human Services provides more discretionary grant funding than just about any other agency. So the first thing is, right off the bat, again, this is going to be an online form. When you get into Workspace, along the left, you're going to provide information on what's the name of the grant program, okay? Typically, this is on the first page of the RFP. And so what you write in the grant program is actually the name of the grant, right? So for example, we could write cooperative agreement to support navigators and federally facilitated exchanges. And then in 1B, you're going to write your CFDA number, which in this particular case was 93,332. Now, most of the time when you're applying for a grant for the first time, you're not dealing with these next ones, right? The estimated unobligated funds. These are for people who are doing these forms as part of their renewal process, meaning they're going to have unobligated funds that are rolling over into the next year. You may be asked to fill out the same kind of form that you have here after you've been awarded. But if you're applying for the first time, you have a new budget and you're being asked, well, how much are you asking for? So that's in the federal column, and then the amount that you put into the non-federal column is your match amount. Now, one of the reasons this form is so confusing for so many people is because it's designed to cover multiple situations. And this is why mistakes happen, right? So you need to check your RFP to notice if you're applying for 1 year or all of the years together. Most of the time when you fill out this form, you're only putting in numbers for just year 1. So you write in to 1E, this federal box right here, that you write in how much you're requesting from the federal government for year 1. Then in 1F, you write your match amount for the first year. It's going to then automatically total them to the right. So for example, if I write in 100,000 for my year 1 ask, and then I have, let's say I have a 1-to-1 match, and I have now 200,000 in that far right hand column, okay? As you can see, if I put in, let's say navigators, right here, and I say it's 93,33, I'm just making up numbers at this point, and I scroll down, you're gonna see that it's gonna start pre-populating some of these other boxes. There are some boxes I wish it would populate more, but it doesn't always, okay? Then down below here in the object class categories, these are really similar budget categories to those that we saw with the Department of Education: personnel, fringe, travel, equipment, supplies, contractual, construction, and other, plus your total direct charges and indirect here, okay? There are no participant stipends in the SF424A, just totals. Now, there's an additional line, program income. Most programs you would apply to will not have you fill out program income, but occasionally you may be making money off of your program, and then you may need to put that in this section if required. But most of us will simply put 0 in this cell. Now, if you're required to put a non-federal column into this form, you'll need to adjust section A and actually put your non-federal amount in this second line. I'm going to adjust this right here so that I write right here, non-federal, and you'll see that then it populates into this second column, okay? The reason for that is then you're able to describe in the first column what your ask is, and then in the second column, you will be able to write in information about your match, okay? And that way everything adds up correctly, okay? In section C, non-federal resources, this is about where those non-federal dollars are coming from, right? So row 8 is actually going to be zeros because, as we talked about earlier, that's the federal request. Row 9, let's say that we have that matching grant of $100,000. We need to come up with $100,000, and let's say we have $50,000 from the state, and we have a foundation grant for $25,000, and then let's say that your organization is coming up with that balance themselves to equal that $100,000, okay? That way it matches up to section A, okay? You can also edit out line 8 in section C if you like it to be cleaner. Changing the headers in this section will not affect headers in the previous section. Now there's 3 small sections left to this form. Section D, this is forecasted cash needs. Basically, when do you plan on spending and drawing down your funds? If you don't know, just divide it by 4. Note it doesn't allow cents, so if you have an odd number, you're going to have one of the quarters be a little bit more or less. It totals it, and it's important that rows 13 and 14 match those in section A, columns E and F. Otherwise, your system is going to register an error when you submit, but not necessarily when you simply enter the numbers, because Workspace is really just looking to see if you've filled out all the required items in the form. So some people are more sophisticated about this and average out their salary costs and then determine when they'll buy supplies and travel, but it won't matter for most discretionary programs. It's just an estimate. Section E, the estimates for federal funds needed for the balance of the project, is what you will use for subsequent years. So if this is the first future year, otherwise known as the second year of the project, and so on. This is the most common error that people think that column 16B is the first year of the grant, and it's not. It's the second year of the grant. So if you have a 3-year grant, the first 2 columns of section E will be filled out. That's year 2 and year 3. The detail will be put in your budget narrative. Then section F, other budget information, is not needed, frankly, for many programs. But if you have something odd with your indirect cost, you can make a note of it here. If you're doing a modified direct cost rate and it's on a smaller amount because you had to exclude items to follow the MTDC rules, you might note the smaller amount in direct charges, or that you're using an MTDC in indirect charges. Most of the time, that information is in your budget narrative and it isn't required unless the RFP expressly tells you to put it in. At no point in the form do they ask you for your indirect cost rate in this form. So some people list it here too. Okay. All right, so I see one other question. Can we use the de minimis indirect cost rate and also apply for indirect cost rate? The answer to that actually is no. You have to use a a just salary, a 10% of indirect, 10% of your salaries and benefits only. And then note that you're also applying for a negotiated cost rate according to the guidelines, okay? So then the third one that I want to talk to you about is one that is with the Department of Justice. Now, the Department of Justice has recently upgraded its portal to Just Grants. So what you're seeing here in this budget detail worksheet actually says that it expires 11/30/2020 because that's when they announced the Just Grant portal. But I'm providing it today because I think it's still a really good template to use now if you've not already been used to the Department of Justice, much less the Just Grant system. So this gives you an idea of the level of detail required in the portal. It also provides information about all these budget category descriptions kind of in this first worksheet they have here. As I scroll down, you'll see all of these descriptions. And I just think that's a really helpful thing to have, especially if you're new to federal grants. Using this budget detail worksheet will help you prepare for the level of detail that is in the online system for Just Grants. Here you have all the information about the people, their name, their position, how you came up with the total, how much you're going to ask for, whether it's in hours or days or months in terms of time, and all of these different definitions. If you look closely at the form, you can see there are little red triangles in the corner. This provides guidance on the cells. They will tell you if they're part of automatic calculations or not, or if it's just additional data that you can provide. Now, let's take a look, scroll down here a little bit to fringe benefits. You can list them as a total percentage by person, or if you're like many other agencies I know, you may need to list them out all separately if some are percentages and some are flat dollar totals. And in this form and in the Just Grants portal, the budget justification is actually immediately following this data. It's not an additional attachment. So you can see where it says narrative here, pop-up box, there's a little box right underneath it, and it will expand as you need it to include the information immediately following the data, okay? So then let's take a look at travel. DOJ requires you to provide pretty specific information about your travel, including the reason for the travel, the location, and you must type out each type of expense separately. So that might include airfare, hotel, per diem, etc. Okay? Then again, as you go further down, you'll take a look at things like equipment, supplies, construction. These are really similar to other forms in the fact that it's like, hey, how many of them, what's the unit cost, and it just kind of adds them up, okay? But then we go down to sub-awards, okay? Sub-awards is another section which makes a lot of people go, oh my goodness, there's so much detail, okay? This is for people, again, who are providing activities to be carried out in accordance with the grant. In essence, they are responsible for providing one or more of your objectives of your grant, right? So that's true partnerships, sub-awards. Next are consultants, okay? Consultants, that you need to put information about the contract and whether anyone needs to be paid travel costs. So a lot of times we don't necessarily have consultants in some awards, but we do have consultants in procurement contracts because they're services that the person is providing. Now, procurement may or may not be a word that you're familiar with. Procurement is when we're buying things or services. For example, if you're purchasing evaluation services, you have to provide that here. DOJ has really strong feelings about promoting free and open competition in awarding contracts, and really I would say that that's reflective of a lot of the requirements at the federal level. They also have very, very specific rules about whether you can use sole source or not check your RFP for the threshold for your grant, okay? Again, there are questions about whether this contract will be for a consultant and whether travel will be required, okay? So you keep going on down here and you'll see other costs. This is things that a lot of people would otherwise think of as being indirect costs, but if you can tie them specifically to this project, then they would fit in other, such as rent, telephone, janitorial, security. Be careful though. DOJ says if it's a contract, it goes somewhere else. Don't worry too much if something gets in the wrong category, just do your best. I've never seen them line item veto any items out. They simply make you update your budget before you get your official go ahead to start spending your funds. And several of the other federal agencies are the same way. Then, as I keep scrolling down here, you see your indirect costs. You have the option of de minimis if you don't have a federally negotiated indirect cost rate agreement. Unlike other forms, there's no summary at the bottom. Instead, it's actually on a whole nother tab of this worksheet, right? So there's budget detail 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5, and then budget summary, okay? And it's actually on a separate page of the Just Grant system as well. As to the non-federal amounts, you can see that they're just asking for totals here in your forms pretty consistently, and then you'll still be expected to explain them in the narrative box below, right? So you'll see also they provide you with an example budget detail sheet for you to take a look at really what's the level of detail they're looking for, okay? Are there any questions to start out with? I think I've caught most of them in the questions section, but are there any additional questions that people have that I might have missed on the forms and categories?
And so could you just clarify then the answers to this? The first question, can we use the de minimis indirect and also apply for a negotiated?
Right, so, and the guidance which with the Department of Education form is actually the most clear in the fact that if you are applying for a negotiated indirect cost rate agreement, the only type that you can use is just a temporary rate of 10% of salaries and wages. You cannot use the full de minimis rate for your whole entire project. And de minimis can be used indefinitely. Lots of organizations are doing it, and frankly, the federal government is just fine with that because it's a lot less work on their part as well, okay? So not just for your first grant. This 10%, I have some people that I know that have a negotiated rate of 10% of wages and salaries and wages. Other people just use that in that first one, and that's kind of that confusion. Okay. All right. So then I'm gonna go to our slides, and I do know that somebody asked about whether the slides would be provided. Yes, though you'll see that I just kind of use those opening 3 forms to explain that. We will also provide those forms for you as well because they don't really fit well with the PowerPoint. So next we're going to focus on the justification or the narrative that goes along with these forms. For most federal agencies, forms and narratives are separate documents. There are some notable exceptions like the Department of Justice, but most of the time you have a form that has totals in on Workspace, and then you have a budget narrative or budget justification that you upload to Workspace as a PDF. A well-written federal budget justification is a key component for the successful implementation of a federal grant. There's a perception that implementing federal grants is difficult and risky. Many people fear they're going to have to return money to the federal government because they've not spent their federal grant funds properly. But the reality is that a well-written budget justification, ideally written as a team of the grant professional, the project director, the finance staff, will help to ensure exactly what expenditures need to be spent after the grant is awarded. Really, this becomes the most sticky when people change their project, but a well-developed project is fairly straightforward to implement. Now, there are federal regulations that define what you can and can't do with federal grant funding, and many of these regulations are found in 2 CFR 200. Now, if you're a person like me who likes to spell out and understand the acronyms you use, think of these like a book. The book is Title 2, that is the 2 at the beginning. It has subtitles and then chapters and then parts. So this is Title 2, Part 200 of Subtitle A of Chapter 2 of the Code of Federal Regulations, and that's what CFR stands for. You can find 2 CFR 200 at www.ecfr.gov. This is the electronic version of these regulations and the most up-to-date information. In fact, the website will tell you the exact date they were last updated, and you'll see references to various parts of the CFR in the federal grant application or in your RFP. Now, within 2 CFR 200, there's a section called Subpart E. This is where we're going to spend a lot of time today. This is called the cost principles. Here is where we find the basic considerations one must examine when building a federal budget, and with it, the federal budget narrative. The application of these cost principles should require no significant changes in your internal accounting policies and practices of the organization, unless you don't have any written down. Your accounting practices must be consistent with these cost principles and support the accumulation of costs as required by the principles, and must provide for adequate documentation to support costs charged to a federal award. Now, while there are 76 areas within 200.400, we're really going to focus the majority of our time on 3 of them: allowability, reasonable costs, and allocable costs. These are primarily covered in 403 to 405, but you can see they're also covered in 408 to 412 as well. Now, as I go in here, feel free again to keep putting your questions in the chat, and I'll answer them as I can throughout, okay? Now, there are 8 factors that affect the allowability of costs, okay? The costs must be necessary and reasonable for the activities in your federal grant, and you must be able to allocate the costs under these cost principles. While we're going to talk more about reasonable and allocable later, the necessary part of this factor is the federal government saying, don't put anything in your grant budgets you don't actually need. I don't know about the rest of you, but I have definitely needed to have this conversation with project directors who think that federal grant money is like Christmas. They come up with a long list of all the things they want, and they don't really need to implement the project. These costs must conform to any limitations or exclusions listed in the cost principles. These limitations might include types of expenses or amount of cost items, right? So 200.420 through 476 is a long list of selected items which have additional guidance in the regulation. So, for example, 200.423, alcoholic beverages, and it says the cost of alcoholic beverages are ding, 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 unallowable, as are alumni activities, bad debts, commencement and convocation costs, contributions and donations of cash, property, and services to other entities, entertainment costs, fundraising incurred to raise capital or obtain contributions, good or services for personal use, lobbying, membership in country clubs or social clubs, and student activity costs like intramurals, publications, etc. These always make me laugh because I think in order for them to have been put here, it means that somebody had to have tried to put it in a federal grant at some point in time. Now, your policies and procedures must be applied exactly the same, whether a cost is paid for by federal grant money or other revenue. What does that mean? Well, for one, it means that you can't treat grant revenue differently than you do other revenue you receive. For example, I was talking to a client who wanted me to create a budget narrative for a DOJ grant for him. He had not been taking a salary as the executive director because his nonprofit was relatively young. So he asked me, how much should he put into his grant for his salary? And I said, well, you should talk to your board of directors about what they consider to be a reasonable salary that the board felt they could maintain after the grant was over. The point of this is that it shouldn't matter if the executive director's salary is federally funded or funded with individual giving. The organization can't pay the executive director $100,000 a year when they're supported by a federal grant and only $50,000 a year when they're supported by other funding. Another example is a project director who told each of her staff in her project at the organization how much they were going to write into the grant for their salaries. But the project director didn't run these salaries by the finance office before submitting the grant to match up with the current salaries of the employees. So while the salaries listed in the grant were reasonable and competitive for their geographic area, the organization still couldn't pay them the higher amounts listed in the grant because that would be treating grant revenue differently than other revenue sources. Fourth, the costs must be treated consistently. A cost can't be assigned as a direct cost if it's as an indirect cost in a different circumstance. To understand this, we really need to talk about the definition of direct cost and indirect cost. Direct costs are costs that can be specifically and readily identified with a particular project or activity, right? 2 CFR 200 subpart E and the cost accounting standards require costs to be accumulated and reported at the same level proposed in the budget. For example, if scientific supplies are listed in the grant proposal, then an expense code must be used to charge these supplies. General supplies would not provide sufficient detail and then would place that grant out of compliance. Indirect costs are those that are incurred by the organization for common objectives or multiple projects and cannot be identified specifically with a particular project or program. These costs are also known as facilities and administration costs or overhead. Now, when charging costs that are typically indirect directly to a federal award, you must use an object code that clarifies the allocability and or the allowability. For example, long distance calls are usually allowed as a direct cost because it's easier to account for the individual costs of these calls. Local calls are typically not allowable as a direct cost because the nature of the award is one where an inordinate amount of local calls are required, like let's say a survey grant. Similar to the point about salaries above, you can't count a cost as a direct cost in one grant and an indirect cost in another grant. For example, just because a grant allows rent as a direct cost doesn't mean that it is a direct cost. A direct cost has to be readily identified with a particular project or an activity. If multiple activities are taking place in that given building, it would probably be difficult to determine exactly how to allocate these costs to a project. That said, if you can figure out a reasonable allocation plan, then the cost belongs in direct costs for both projects. But you can't call it a direct cost in one grant and an indirect cost in another grant. These costs must be determined in accordance with generally accepted accounting principles or GAAP. The costs must not be used to meet cost sharing or matching requirements of other federal grants or programs. Federal grants can't be used to match most of the time other federal grants. This can be especially tricky if your organization has a lot of federal grants or if you have significant state grant funding. Now, the reason for that it's tricky is because, frankly, a lot of state grant funding is actually federal funding, which has been awarded to the states that they are re-granting or passing through these dollars that are federal dollars. So if you have an organization that tells you, hey, I got a grant from the state, you probably should inquire whether the originating agency is actually a federal one. The costs have to be adequately documented. If you don't document it, it didn't happen. We'll talk more about this after we talk about allowable, reasonable, and allocable. And the costs must be incurred during the approved budget year. This is one of the reasons that grant writing costs cannot be included in a federal grant budget. The costs were incurred before a grant was awarded, and thus are not part of the approved budget period for the grant award. Frankly, this is pretty common even for foundation grants. Now, as I mentioned earlier, one of the factors used to determine if something is allowable is whether it's reasonable. And while this seems like a subjective term, the federal government says a cost is reasonable if, in its nature and amount, it doesn't exceed what would be incurred by a prudent person under the circumstances prevailing at the time the decision was made to incur the cost. The question of reasonableness, is particularly important when an organization has a significant portion of their budget from federal funding. So there are 5 considerations for determining reasonableness. 1, whether the cost of the type generally recognized as ordinary and necessary for the proper and efficient performance of the grant. For example, you can't just buy the highest priced computer you can find if a normal off-the-shelf laptop would work just fine. That said, if you're buying additional software or peripherals for that computer because it must be available to make accommodations for persons with disabilities, that would be reasonable. The requirements or restraints imposed by sound business practices, laws and regulations, and the terms of the grant award. Obviously, a cost shouldn't break any laws and should just make good business sense. Third, market prices for comparable goods or services in the geographic area. For example, just because you want to pay someone more doesn't mean that the federal government will support this. Our agency works on National Science Foundation grants a lot. These grants award research grants to, let's say, some small businesses working on innovative ideas they want to commercialize for the SBIR program. They often hire very technical staff, and some of these staff have very high salaries to be competitive for their years of experience. Now, often small businesses will then pay a premium for these staffs to kind of lure them away from large companies. To address this issue, the National Science Foundation actually encourages their project directors to list the Department of Labor's Bureau of Labor Statistics job categories and then the average and range for these salaries. This helps them see how different geographic areas may have a different reasonable rate for some very technical and often difficult to fill positions in a given area. Number 4, whether the individuals acted with prudence, considering their responsibilities to the agency that was funded, its employees, the public at large, and the federal government. And this can sometimes be more easily understood if you think of this like a for-profit organization. Would your shareholders consider this reasonable? Another way to think of this is whether the public would think if it was reasonable, it was printed on the front page of the newspaper. Would it go viral on social media if someone posted about it? And number 5, whether the organization significantly deviated from its own practices and policies, which then causes an unjustifiable increase in the cost. For example, if an organization would normally put out a bid for a contract, but they deviated from that practice because they felt they didn't need to do that for some reason, perhaps expediency to keep a project from getting behind. If not putting a contract out for bid meant that they simply took whatever quick quotes they could, they may be paying significantly more for the work instead of forcing the companies to really compete for a reasonable rate. Now, speaking of bidding, some departments can be pretty sensitive about sole source. What does that mean? Well, sole source means that you're claiming that nobody else is providing the goods or services that you seek to purchase except for the organization with whom you plan to purchase them. If you're buying laptops, there may be many companies, right, that sell those. If you've already gone through a bid process for your organization and you now have a contracted vendor, you can then purchase from that vendor. If you've been working with a colleague who's an evaluator, you cannot just agree to work with them as your external evaluator. First, you have to describe whether you have a formal written procurement policy and whether you have a process that aligns with the federal acquisition regulations, which are designed to promote free and open competition in awarding procurement contracts. Second, if you do think you have something unique that causes you to work with just one company, you're going to need to provide a very specific sole source justification if that contract is over the simplified acquisition threshold, which is currently set at $250,000. Some of you may have a lower level than that, but that's the federal level. A lot of organizations claim that their consultant is the only provider of that service, but in reality, that's really designed to get around bidding rules by their agency or by the federal agency, which take longer to implement and determine. In addition, similar to the external evaluator example I already talked about, some consultants have assisted with prior work on the grant proposal or in some other ways with the organization in order to get past the bidding requirements. Bidding is an important part of keeping publicly funded projects free from conflict of interest and bias. And as our country really starts to pay more attention to how power has been kept from minority populations for a long time, I think the issue of bidding and restrictions on sole source will actually only become bigger. In addition to the contractual total, the Department of Justice, for example, has already put a $650 a day limit for consultants, and that changes over time. So if you happen to be watching this later, just know that. What does this really mean? Well, on an hourly rate, it equates to only $81.25 per hour for a standard 8-hour day. So any hourly rate higher than that is going to set off a red flag. It does not mean that the consultant can't have a rate higher than that. It simply means that the DOJ expects a justification why the rate is higher and has the right to actually reject that justification before you spend any money on that consultant. And if you can show that the going rate for this type of consultant is higher, or if what they want to provide is unique in some way, you have the opportunity to present that as a justification. That said, I just did a SAMHSA grant, Substance Abuse and Mental Health Services Administration, and they actually rejected quite a few justifications and simply said, you know what, we're just kind of staying at this cap. It's too high. Now, one of the best ways to handle this is to bid your project so you can show you didn't get any bids below the $650 a day limit. B, provide a detailed scope of work with hours estimate for each service. C, provide costs beyond the hourly rate, such as travel or materials outside of the hourly rate, and provide a resume or CV which show the unique or high level of qualifications of that individual. Okay, so what I've given you here are a couple of examples, a simplified one and then a more detailed one. Okay, now allocable is probably the most confusing section to write for a federal budget justification. But in general, you have to either be able to say that the purchase was made in whole to be charged to the grant, or you have to be able to say that you have some kind of reasonable formula to allocate the expenditures to one program or another if they're shared costs. A cost is allocable to a project if goods or services involved are chargeable or assignments in accordance to the relative benefits received by the projects. Okay, that's the standard they're holding it to. This standard is met if it's incurred specifically for the grant, 100% for the project. The benefits both the federal grant award and other work of the organization and can be distributed in proportions that may be approximated using reasonable methods. Here, you'll need to determine a reasonable method to proportion the costs to the various programs. That's that cost allocation concept I was talking about earlier. And is it necessary to the overall operation of the organization and assignable in part to the federal grant? Here, you need to determine a reasonable method to determine what portion will be assigned to the federal grant. For example, our team worked on an early Head Start grant. The teachers in the early Head Start grant who had 100% of their home visitation caseload were easy to allocate 100% to the grant. The early childhood director had both early Head Start and non-early Head Start home visitation families. So we allocated her time based on the number of families. 60 early Head Start families meant 60% of her time could be allocated to the grant. Then the program added a new administrative position, a finance director, that had not been there before, but a position that they felt was very necessary given the extent of the federal regulations for the Head Start program. But how to allocate this time? The original thought of the organization had been to allocate the position based on the finances managed by the finance director. This would mean allocating about 50% of his salary and benefits to the grant. To the organization, this was parallel to the teachers. Teachers managed children, finance directors managed money. Head Start said no. They said the closest reasonable allocation method would be to use staffing, not money, because he was in an administrative position and budgets for these programs might be too variable. Now, for this organization, using staffing happened to be pretty close because so much of the budget for the organization was salaries for the program staff. In the end, it worked out well for them because Head Start actually slightly more staff due to its greater requirements. So they were able to allocate 52% of his time to the grant instead of 50%. But that just gives you one example of reasonableness. Now, as I've already mentioned before, my favorite budget to use for allocation is the Department of Justice, right? Their form really guides you to provide the level of detail you need for the allocation. So for example, in personnel, right? You have to list the person's salary, and then you have to list whether that's hourly, weekly, monthly, etc. For example, if we say that this is $140,000 a year salary, and that salary is annual or yearly, then the time would simply be 1 for a year. And then you can see here that the percentage of time is 50% to the project. So you write that 50 in the percentage box. On the other hand, if I had an hourly employee who made $22 an hour, I would put 22 in the salary box, then use that drop down in the rate section to make that hourly, and then say, okay, well, how many hours does that person work? In this particular case, it's 1,040 because the person works 20 hours a week, right? So 20 hours a week times 52 weeks a year, 1040. If 100% of those 20 hours were allocated to this project, then we put 100%. But if only 10 of their 20 hours were allocated to this project, I would put in 15%. Now, not all departments give you this clear of a form, so they expect you to put it in the narrative. Here you're going to create sentences like word problems, right? We used to have in middle school math classes. For example, for salaries, I either list every single position and the current salary of the person in the position, right? So if I have a finance director who's uncomfortable with this because you have a significant turnover in this position, or if you know you're going to need to hire for the position, it's not uncommon to use some kind of industry or geographic area average and then show the multiplication. For example, hiring 2 case managers at $45,000 per case manager equals $90,000. If you're hiring 4 positions, but they have varying part-time, full-time status, you could write it this way: 4 case managers equivalent to 3 FTEs, that's 1 FTE plus 1 FTE plus 2 0.5 FTEs. Then you might explain that the 2 part-time case managers will be working shorter shifts that need extra coverage from 5 to 9 p.m. Or if I was seeking funding for a 2.5 FTE case manager, I might explain that the 0.5 FTE was actually a split position with another program to reassure them that this is still a full-time position, which is easier to hire than a part-time position, plus 2 new full-time positions. Now with fringe benefits, this can create some interesting math based on both FTE and salary. For example, payroll taxes are based on salary, so a formula for that might be $45,000 per case manager times 2.5 case manager times 7.65% equals $8,606.25. Unemployment, maybe let's say up to $12,500 per position. So your formula is 3 case managers times 3% unemployment times $12,500 salary maximum equals $1,125. Health insurance is often done by a flat average for the organization or a particular rate for that position. For example, you might have, let's say, $5,100 annual health insurance times 2.5 FTE case managers. That equals $12,750 on the assumption that your half-time FTE person still needs half of the health insurance covered under this program, and the other half will be covered by, let's say, that other program. Or if someone doesn't need health insurance because it's covered, let's say, under their spouse, you could just say, while there are 2.5 FTE case managers, only 1.5 FTEs are electing coverage this year. If there are tiers of coverage, you could say, based on historical knowledge, we anticipate that one position will have a health insurance tier of $4,500 and the other 2 positions will be at $5,100. ABC organization offers multiple tiers of health insurance to ensure employees are able to select what is best for their families. I added that explanation at the end because otherwise it might be a question, you might get a question of this, or you could say, historically, 2 of the positions would fit into a higher tier due to their age or something like that. You could state this is an average by saying, while the exact cost of health insurance is not yet known for the new staff, ABC organization anticipates it will be about $5,100 per FTE based on the organization average, or maybe based on the anticipated years of experience of the positions, or something like that. While these 2 areas are the ones that I find people can lump numbers in together without sufficient details, the other 2 are travel and supplies. With local travel, you should be able to use the IRS mileage rate for nonprofits, or if your organization has a different rate, explains what it is and explain why it's different. Then if you state the number of miles, you might have a formula that says something like, the average case manager travels 20 to 30 miles per day as they meet clients in their home or drive them to their appointments. This is 25 miles per day times 5 days a week times 50 weeks per year, accounting for vacation, times 0.51 per mile times 2.5 case managers equals $7,968.75. Note, I did not round it up to $8,000. If I was doing a federal grant that required me to round the numbers to a whole number, I still would use the full formula in my budget justification, but then in the ask I would state 7,969, or I've also put about 7,970 in before. For national travel, I look up a couple of flight costs from my local airport to where a conference will be located. Then I either use my organization's per diem rate, or I look up the per diem rates set by the Federal General Services Administration, or GSA, right? And I've given you there at the bottom here that the link to that to those rates. I'll also drop that here in the chat for those of you that are looking for it. Okay. These rates are set in October of each year and are set based on kind of major cities or states across the continental United States. You can find information by putting in the zip code or the city and state of the location where you're going to be traveling, or by looking up the state if your city is not listed. These per diem rates include lodging by month, excluding taxes, and then meals and incidentals. For meals and incidentals, there's a total that includes breakfast, lunch, dinner, and incidentals, as well as an an individual breakdown for items such as $55 for that day, or $13 for breakfast, $14 for lunch, $23 for dinner, and $5 for incidentals. There's also a rate of 75% for the first and last day of travel, if that makes sense as well. Too often, I see people just say $1,000, $1,200, $1,500, or $2,500 for travel costs without any details. And instead, they could be using a formula such as the ones that we have written here on the slide. Notice that I put in details like the fact that the flight was a round trip, that the hotel was a conference rate, the per diem was the GSA rate. I also noted that the conference was for 3 days and its location. I subtotaled within each category, and then I gave a final math problem at the end so they could see how I determined each number. Even something like supplies can be allocated if you put some thought into it. For example, if these are just office supplies, which many people understand may be pulled together for efficiency of cost, then divide it by the number of people in the office, like $100 a person per year times 2.5 case managers. Or like if the narrative refers to the case managers keeping paper files in the evaluation section or having paper assessments, you might want to say something like $10 per month times 12 months times 2.5 case managers equals $300. This may show that there's an ongoing cost that the case managers will need replenished. I also like to point out what types of things will be considered supplies: pens, paper, binders, file folders, printer ink. When you list it like that, the reviewers mentally think about buying their own supplies and how quickly that adds up when they're doing that shopping for themselves. So we had to do this for a Head Start grant, and we had to talk about classroom supplies. We emphasized that teachers use a lot of hands-on materials with students, especially for math or science. So we actually had a supply line labeled curriculum supplies. And these were supplies which supported the implementation of the curriculum. This was different than classroom supplies, which we also had things like toilet paper, cleaning supplies, or office supplies for the teachers, which we described as like staplers, file folders, etc. Then for the first two categories, we did our formula using the number of students in the classroom versus the last one in which we did it by a formula of the teachers in the program. Now, part of allowability is that the cost must be adequately documented. But if you don't know what adequate documentation is, it can both be nerve-wracking and risky for the awardee. First, each entity must keep records about the award amount. Second, each entity must keep records stating who has the authority to make expenditures against those budget lines and who approves those expenditures. Documentation of the approval process is important to make sure that not just anybody can charge expenditures to those lines and that a second person is checking the expenditure. Third, each entity must keep records stating what the funds are being used for, whether it's someone's salary and fringe benefits for their time, equipment and supplies, someone's mileage or travel, or purchased services. The federal government would say that each agency should use its own documentation policies and procedures, but I've worked with many agencies receiving their first federal grant, especially small places, who don't have any of these policies and procedures already in place, but they want to do the right thing. So what do I tell them? Well, one, if you're using a credit card, keep a receipt which has enough detail to show the exact items on it. I don't know about you, but many receipts don't do this well anymore. So it's best to attach their receipt to an explanation. Then ideally, you're going to scan it or take a picture of it so it can be electronically filed in your accounting system. If your accounting system doesn't allow this, well, ideally you should get one that does, but you should have an electronic folder for all your receipts by budget category, like equipment, supplies, travel, etc. If you're tracking mileage, keep a log in your car that shows the initial mileage and the end mileage, or a round trip, initial mileage, destination mileage, and return mileage, as well as a box that lists like the purpose of the trip. Training with your program staff will help you let them know what's in the grant and what is in alignment with what you wrote for the budget narrative. For example, if a literacy coach is traveling from school to school to do observations with teachers, the coach is going to put in the purpose section of the mileage log the name of the school and perhaps even the name of the teacher if they're only making one observation. If you're a case manager driving a client to get identification, you write down their name or maybe like a first name and last initial and the place you're going, like the Department of Motor Vehicles, Social Security Office, etc. For national travel, keep credit card receipts for purchases like rental cars and flights. If you're using per diem, make sure you have documentation of the location of the event and the GSA rate for that location. I like to include screenshots for that location in my documentation. If you're tracking staff time, time and effort reports are required, not optional. If the staff member has 100% of their time dedicated to the project, this is easy. They simply sign a piece of paper monthly that acknowledges that their salary is dedicated to this project and funded by this grant. If they're part-time, it's likely to be more complicated. If the employee works at a desk all day, they can keep track of their time based on the activities they're doing. If the employee charges their time to different grants depending upon the program their client is working on, they need to keep track of it that way. For example, a case manager who works with a client who must be at or below the federal poverty level would track the start and end time they worked with each client. Then once they determine on a daily basis which of these clients are at or below poverty, they can add up the time spent with those clients for the day and write down those hours for that day to be allocated to the grant. On a weekly or monthly basis, the employee simply signs that time and effort report and turns it into finance, which then allocates that portion of their salary to the grant. Internal controls will help you make sure that the same person who can create a position to be paid is not the same person who will pay them through the grant. It's a checks and balances system to prevent fraud. What is not acceptable is for an organization to simply allocate the time automatically every single month without any documentation or timesheet. If an organization is audited, it must be able to defend why it allocated the salary and benefits to those percentages other than, well, it's what the grant said. Okay. For purchase services, you need to follow your own organization procedures for bid thresholds, sole source, and things like conflict of interest. If you purchase equipment, you need to make sure you're tagging the items with the name of the program and ideally the grant it was purchased with. I've used label makers for this in the past, whether it's furniture, computers, etc. The key to remember with documentation, if you don't document it, the federal government will say, well, it just didn't happen. Receipts matter, okay? So 3 things to remember. Finance, program, and grants should create a narrative collectively and with sufficient detail to jog everyone's memory after a grant award about why particular costs were included in the proposal. 2, documentation of expenditures should have sufficient detail to align with the budget narrative. If the receipts use a shorthand or if you simply have a credit card charge, take the time to write a 1 to 3 sentence response of what you were purchasing. How is it reasonable? How is it allocable to your grant? And how is allowable under 2 CFR 200? And then develop policies and procedures for the ideal level of documentation for all types of expenditures. Easy ones to start with include time and effort sheets, mileage and event travel, credit card purchases, and bid thresholds and procedures, okay? So there's a lot of information about narratives. I'm hoping that I've been able to help everybody out about what is the federal government's guidelines in this area, but I'll check and see if we have any questions.
So again, everyone, if you do have a question, please enter that in the questions tab. I had a question to see if
Sure.
you could answer. You talked about how, some of the categories you'd be using estimated costs or in anticipated costs, but then, if the actual costs come out differently than that, how worried should we be? Does every difference need an amendment, or is there some, flexibility allowed?
So I would tell you that obviously if your amount is below the amount you allocated, no problem, right? You have extra money. And the question is whether you can spend that extra money or not. But if you're above the amount that you estimated, there's a couple different things. You can choose to do an amendment. Sometimes you, depending upon the agency and the grant, you can actually move across budget lines. And by budget lines, I mean like from supplies into other or something like that. Let's say you hire somebody and they cost more than what you had in salaries. You could choose to spend less in supplies and move that up to salaries. Or the reality is the organization may have to take on those costs themselves. And that is, again, some of what makes people nervous. But that is one of those component pieces. If you're within a section, like if you spent over in scientific supplies and less in office supplies, typically that is less concerning to the federal government because you're all within that one category. You simply document it so that when your auditor comes in and says, hey, why is this higher and this lower? You can say, well, because, when I went to buy these things, I couldn't get it this cheap anymore. And so we chose to spend less in office supplies so that we could get our scientific supplies that we really needed for this project.
Great. And another question here, do you have any recommendations for sample policies, like for time and effort or credit card purchases, etc.?
I do, and I would encourage you to just contact me directly for that. It's not something that we provide just kind of wholesale to people because it kind of depends on what industry you're in. If you're in higher education, that's different than if you're in a maybe a small nonprofit, those types of things. So if that person can just reach out to me, or anybody can reach out to me and ask about that. Yep.
All right, and next question here. How do you suggest capturing COLA, cost of living allowance increases in budget narratives? Do federal agencies generally allow COLA increases to be included?
So the great answer is yes, but, right? But you have to actually put it and plan for it in advance. So let's say we have a 3-year grant, and I assume that I'm paying someone $45,000 in year 1, and then I'm anticipating a 3% increase in the next year. And frankly, right, in this year, some of these agencies are kind of panicking, right, because they have budgeted a 3% increase, but then their staff are getting a 5% increase due to the fact that the inflationary pressures on wages right now are so high. I heard the other day somebody was telling me it's like 7 or 8% this is likely to be this year. And each organization has to kind of make that decision whether their grant funded staff can only receive that 3% increase, or whether the agency is going to pay for the balance of those costs. And that can get interesting, right? If you're trying to say, well, the person's 100% allocated to this project, but the organization's paying for a portion of it. Some organizations have to really convince people to work on federal grants, and so they treat grant-funded staff slightly differently in terms of their raises than others. I used to work for a school district, and raises were raises, and it was across the board. And so if we had put in the person, the budget had a 3% increase, but the district only gave us a 2% increase that year, we didn't get our 3% raise that was budgeted in the grant. We only got the 2%. But the flip side was also true, that if it was budgeted at 3% and the district chose to do a 4%, we still got the 4%. The district just made up the difference. But in your narrative, you just simply say, in year 2, we estimate a 3% increase, and in the year 4, another 3% increase, or so on and so forth. And I've seen as high as 5%. I don't know that I've seen higher than that, though with current inflationary pressures, it wouldn't surprise me if people this year are putting in their grants a little bit higher on those COLAs.
Great. And that looks like it covers all of our questions. So I think with that, we'll close. Again, Julie's contact information and the ACEL Grant Services website is there linked on the screen. So really want to thank everyone for joining today, and you'll be receiving a follow-up email from us with a survey. Hope you please take that to give us some feedback, and look forward to seeing you again at a future webinar. Thanks, everyone.
Great. Thanks, everyone.